Welcome to the World Movers Podcast. I'm your host, DJ Angel Fire, with my co-host, Rubar Code. And today we have our guest, Graham Massey. He is one of the founding members behind the very popular British group 808 State. Graham, would you like to introduce yourself and just start us off with kind of who you are and what you're doing now?
I've been in 808 State for over 30 years now, and previously to 808 State, I was also a musician for about 10 years before that. So yeah, music is my first love. I don't really seek out any alternatives to doing that. I make music all the time, hope to be doing it into the future. It's been a couple of weird years at the moment with the pandemic in the UK and obviously everywhere else. So that has been an interruption to almost an uninterrupted life in music. So yeah, it feels a strange point in my life at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware the entertainment sector's really suffered, particularly from the pandemic. Just wondering, how have you adapted to the situation, or are you just using it as a chance to refresh?
Yeah, in a kind of forceful way. We were, when the pandemic hit in the UK back in February 2020, we were just about to go on tour, and that tour for 808 was on the back of releasing an album that November. So everything that you were working towards suddenly, stopped. And it was a very odd feeling, to be arrested in that way, because it was all about momentum and taken maybe 2 or 3 years building up to that point, So yeah, it was kind of an odd situation. One thinks that everyone would get kind of very creative in that period of where everyone is locked at home, but it hasn't really been that for me, because it was on the back of like many years of leading up to something. I don't feel like I've discharged the bullet in the gun yet, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So I keep expecting that creativity will return, because it's something I'm really used to, but it feels like a little blocked or something, So that's how I'm feeling. Yeah.
This album you mentioned you were going to release just before the pandemic. Is that related to the release from a few days ago?
No, actually, yeah. So one thing that we have been doing during lockdown is remastering the whole of the ZTT back catalogue. When we signed to ZTT back in, it will be 1989 that we signed to them, with all that music is still owned by ZTT, the albums that we did with them. And they have been bought up by Universal Music, and that's all now we basically pulling in things from the archive that fit into that era, and tidying it up and making sure it's all digitized properly, because a lot of it was missing. A lot of it there was gaps in the catalogue. So it's been I spent a lot of time dwelling in the past there, so that felt a bit odd for a while. And I've been kind of writing up almost like sleeve notes to go along with these reissues. In a way, because I'm working with a lot of people that weren't born in 1989, I'm working with people who were born in the 90s, and I just want to illuminate the context of our story, really, and how back then, pre-internet and, pre the big, just as the rave revolution was starting, why we made the music that we did, because it must be quite confusing to just jump into a lot of 808 State music, because it's coming from many directions. It's not just genre based, like a lot of dance music is, or got in the preceding years. You know, it became very much you stayed in your camp. You know, 808 was very exploratory. It was very experimental, and some of it worked, some of it didn't. But you know, we were very much an album band as well, which was like quite a new thing in that with the electronic music there. You know, a lot of there was this rave revolution that we were very kind of attached to, but there was also this technological revolution in music technology that we were very attached to as well. So we were exploring that at the same time. So yeah, it's been interesting sticking our heads back in it, because it's you know, it makes you realize how diverse and colourful our catalogue is.
For people born, you know, post-internet, they might just be going into the rave music without this awareness. And, you know, that includes me in a sense, you know, to give you a bit of context. Me and my family are Irish, but I grew up near Manchester, and I was born in '96, which was actually the year before the Hacienda closed. And I was just wondering, can you describe to me, as somebody who could have only experienced this amazing nightclub for about a year as a baby, and who would even, I never did that, but you know, I wouldn't have had the capabilities to remember that. Can you describe to me what the Hacienda was like?
Yeah, I remember it first opening because I was one of the guys in the band that was in a band called Biting Tongues, a guy called Colin Seddon. He got employed by the Hacienda when it opened. He worked at Virgin Records in the daytime, the big record store in Manchester, and then his evening job was pot collecting the pint pots at the Hacienda. So we were also in this band. We were on Factory Records, so we got a get-in free card to the Hacienda, which was quite a good perk. It means that we could go at any time and not spend any money, so that was good. And the early years of the Hacienda, and for many years, in fact, you know, for a good 3 years or something, it was a very vacuous place. You know, it's like a big warehouse, and it only ever had about, you know, 50 people in it at times. You know, it felt cavernous, and the sound was all kind of bouncing around. And okay, the only time it was ever full is when they put bands on, and usually, like, you know, things like the first time I saw it full, they had Mantronics on. I remember an artist called Mantronics he made a lot of the electro music. You know, he was like a drum machine artist. And I remember thinking, like, oh, there's all these other people that you know, I didn't realize he was so popular in Manchester. You know, suddenly the place was full, and that was an amazing revelation. And then you'd have things like Trouble Funk, and you know, the sort of trendsetters from America would come across, and it felt like a transatlantic connection. That the other clubs in Manchester at the time were a lot smaller. There was certain clubs that did deal in electronic dance music. A place called Legends that was not so far from the Hacienda had an amazing sound system, and it was coming off the back of you know, disco and all the sort of street soul stuff. That was an established place, but all these little clubs in Manchester had little cliques. They were like cliques, you know, of different people into different bits of culture. And Hacienda was the first place that fused all those. You know, it was big enough to blend people. So it was the first club where it felt really all the tribes could gather in it, and there was a unity to it. And, you know, and that applies also that it wasn't this sort of courtship ritual that used to be in clubs of, you know, boys meet girl kind of thing. It didn't have that. You know, it suddenly was about dancing. When it got to sort of 88 and stuff, it was there was this neutrality to the club. And all walks of life were in there all of a sudden, be it not just teenagers or young people. There was like, you know, nurses and people that did normal jobs. You know, it was a real reflection of the city. You know, that was unusual. It didn't disinclude anyone. And other clubs at that time did structure themselves around certain things. You know, there were the two guys who DJ'd, who were the DJs in 808, Darren and Andrew. They did the Saturday night at a club in North Manchester called the Thunderdome, and that was much more of a harder sound. It was a much sweatier environment, and there was a sense of revolution in that club. You know, it wasn't trendy at all. It was sort of the people that felt disincluded from the glamorous nightlife kind of thing. It was a much younger club. And it pushed music forward, that club. You know, it pushed a much, you know, things like the Prodigy sounded really in place there. You know, this new British sound, this new more aggressive sound. Yeah, the Hacienda felt very international, and then there was a lot of other clubs that felt very, very colloquial and happening. You know,
what would you say has replaced? Well, not replaced, but are there any clubs now or institutions that you think is on par with the Hacienda? Because now the Hacienda is just some apartments, really, some like fancy apartments.
Yeah, I mean, what followed the Hacienda was like, you know, clubs in Britain like Ministry of Sound in London and Cream in Liverpool is another example where they got their branding together. You know, they became a brand. They represented a whole lifestyle almost. And I think they were almost like a spin-off of the Hacienda. The Hacienda has kind of got that brand together post its existence, really, with the advent of Peter Hook taking over the brand. And, you know, it's almost like a nostalgia thing now, you know. And in fact, a lot of the people I know, remember we used to work with MC Tunes, the rapper. Yeah, we made some records with him, and he now MCs for the Hacienda Classical Orchestra, which is really bizarre to think that that would ever happen back then. If you were to project into the future, it's like 30 years in the future, MC Tunes will be on at the Royal Albert Hall with a full symphonic orchestra. That would have been just ridiculous. But that he was doing a gig last week, and with the Hacienda Classical, you know, and it's you couldn't have predicted that, you know. What I'm saying is like, yeah, the Super Club became a thing in the 90s, and all this branding of things is very normal now. You know, it's very about establishing, same with festivals, establishing what you're about, and almost belonging to a club. You know, back then a club was still a movable thing. You know, like for instance, we'd go somewhere before the Hacienda, we'd go to the Hacienda, and then after the Hacienda, everyone would get in the cars and go to a rave. You know, and then that way, from there, they would move on to an after party, and then they would move on to something else. You know, it was like a whole bunch of people moving through the week. You know, there was a point of like, you know, where maybe Tuesday and Wednesday was the weekend, not Friday and Saturday. You know, it was a very engaging time. But what I remember about it most is the amount of amazing music that was coming out every week. That was very important as an inspiration. Being a musician, it was like, have you heard this record? Have you heard that record? And we had a nice system in 808. You know, Martin owned a record store which was called Eastern Bloc, so he was importing American records or music from all over actually. And then we had a radio show, the 808 State radio show, where those records were played. And then, people came back to the shop having heard it. And, it was like almost like a feedback loop of music back then that we were feeding off in terms of inspiration, and music was changing fast. So we were changing our music every week. It was, it's not like, oh, we made a record that sounded like this, let's make another one that sounds like that. Every week we changed the music.
Yeah, and the thing is like, I wonder, because you hear like a lot of music from that time, and it's like you start to recognize like certain samples, and I don't mean like big ones like Funky Drum or Amen Break, but like smaller samples. And I think like, how were samples traveling around between artists at that time? Because there was like no internet. You couldn't just like email stuff to people. How was it that you guys just kind of like came into possession of some of these samples?
Well, one guy's got a record store. That's quite a good source. We're all avid record collectors. Two of the guys were DJs, so they had all the records that they were playing out, and the history of music. To know your history of music was important in our gang. It was kind of like you had to have knowledge, like a cab driver needs to have the knowledge. It was a badge of honor to be very exploratory with the music. It's funny, like, because like we used to, I don't know if you had it where you lived, but we used the record library a lot. The library system in Manchester.
No, I didn't do that growing up.
Yeah.
I guess I just relied on, I think my dad had a lot of records and CDs, so I was, just going through those.
Yeah. And this was pre-CD as well, that I remember tapes were really important, cassettes. And so you go to the record library and you'd make up cassettes, and then you'd copy cassettes and distribute them amongst each other. And it was an important culture to communicate in cassettes. I was talking to somebody the other day that when we first met Bjork, me and Bjork were sending each other cassettes all the time, and that's what she's did a track on Post called Headphones, which is about that communication. And it was like, oh, you like that? Oh, yeah. Oh, that, and it's kind of, it was incredible that somebody in Reykjavik who also worked in a record store honed into the similar vibes, and none of it was to do with electronic music particularly. It was to do with people that were very high energy musicians, people that had a high vibration in music, people like Rassan Roland Kirk, and they were quite rootsy kind of compilations. They weren't listened to current electronic music, but that's a different kind of communication. So what would be in our bag of cassettes when we were in the studio could be all kinds of things, and it wasn't all about bringing the vinyl in. Sometimes a lot of the sampling was from cassettes, and stuff you knew really well because you some of these the advent of the Walkman in my life was like a massive thing, and that probably came out in about 1980, 81. I first got a Walkman that you could travel around listening to music. It was an incredible revolution. Before that, you were fixed, you were fixed in a place listening to music, and then all of a sudden this ability to walk around and environmentally listen to music, that was incredibly important. That's what I remember about Gerald as well. He was just sort of never without a pair of headphones on, even when he was having a conversation with you, he was just permanently under headphones, and he used the same record library as I use, so therefore there was like a common language in that, you know. And we get a lot of stuff like, you know, Bollywood records out of that as well, because of the place that where it was, you know, where that record library was. You know, there's a massive kind of Indian selection in that thing, and that was. You know, you just moved through the whole catalogue, you know, we devoured music, you know.
Yeah. There's a stronger Indian sort of connection with Manchester as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I used to have, there was a place called the Adult Education Centre in Manchester, where you could have free lessons if you were unemployed, if you were on the dole. And I went to one that was called Computer Music. And this would be in about 1984. And this, you know, this was kind of futuristic stuff back then. They had a system called an Alpha Centauri system. And nobody knew how that worked. It was almost like a synclavier. And we had the manual, and the guy that was leading the course, we just went through the manual and tried to get the thing going. And it took about 6 months to get any sound out of the thing. You know? So that was one course we did. And then on a Saturday morning, we'd go and have Indian music lessons with this guy who was in the neighborhood at that same place. And because we had a PA system in the band that we had, he used to take us to loads of Indian gigs around Manchester in people's living rooms, and we'd bring the microphones and the speakers and get fed. And this was amazing, you know, because we were all starving back then, you know. So we'd experience these visiting Indian musicians who were amazing, you know. And everyone recorded them on. Everyone had it looked like a press conference with 20 microphones in front of them. And then the tradition was to throw money down, you know, at them, kind of thing. But yeah, Manchester was full of all these different aspects of musical life. When I was growing up making music, you know, you only ever played music in your city. You rarely got outside the city to play music. You might go to London and do some gigs, or Holland was a popular destination for Manchester bands back then. So you were constantly in competition with the same bands, people like A Certain Ratio, Crispy Ambulance, who we shared a rehearsal room with. There was a sort of, people paid attention to what other people's music was doing, and it was competitive, you know, and I thought that was kind of quite a good environment in a way. You know, it was, colloquial, you know. It wasn't until New Order, a lot of bands who became successful in Manchester moved out of Manchester to London, but New Order didn't do that. They became international and stayed in Manchester and built that club. This was a real inspirational move, you know, for us. Instead, they're like, oh, you can communicate, you know, transcend your city, and yet be your city. You know, that was an interesting template for us that we tried to, you know, allowed us that kind of latitude to be ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, the Manchester music scene in the 80s and 90s is colloquially referred to as Madchester.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this earlier, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I mean, there's so many people who come to mind, but one public figure who I would say is indirectly a mascot for the Manchester scene was the large-headed Frank Sidebottom.
Oh yeah.
I'm really curious. Did your paths ever cross?
Yes, I've seen him without his head on.
Wow.
Because you know, back then he was a prolific musician before he was Frank Sidebottom. Chris Seavey.
Yeah.
And so there'd be like rehearsal, a lot of the rehearsal rooms in Manchester, you know, you would come across that previous generation of musicians and stuff. There was a point, I was living in a certain part of Manchester where it's called the Curry Mile.
Yes, I love the Curry Mile.
Yeah, Rusholme. And so in our block of houses, in one block, there was, I lived there, Manny from Stone Roses lived a couple of doors up. And in that same house, there was a guy called John Ronson, who's now a very famous author.
Yeah.
Have you heard of him? Yeah, because
he wrote the book about Frank Sidebottom.
Yeah, and he was kind of driving Frank Sidebottom around. He was almost like the manager or something, you know. So yeah, you would see them going off in the van and stuff, you know. So it was a very small world, and you know, the other people of that generation, we did a lot of gigs with people like John Cooper Clarke, who was managed by a guy called Alan Wise at the time. So we got a lot of gigs with them, and Alan Wise almost he had John Cooper Clarke and Nico at that time from the Velvet Underground, who was living in North Manchester. It's quite bizarre to go into a supermarket and see Nico sort of looking at the apples or whatever. And we did a lot of gigs with them, which was like, you know, there was you had a sense of community in the musicians in Manchester, just because there weren't that many of them, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned about Indian music, because, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a gentleman in India back in the early 80s who took a bunch of traditional pieces of Indian music and set them to basically use the rolling gear.
He had a whole set of rolling gear, didn't he? That did ragas on, yeah, and it sounds very acid house because it's like 303s and Jupiter 8 and stuff, and yeah, that's pretty amazing. Yeah, that system that we were using in 1988, which was the small grey Roland synthesizers called SH101s that had little sequences in. You could put the notes in and then trigger the notes from the drum machine, and then you could have the 303 synced up to it. This connectivity in the Roland equipment was the thing that where acid house blossomed, you know. But that system had been around since, you know, the early 80s, and there was a guy in Manchester who we knew, who used to be like our support act sometimes. He was like our sound engineer, and he had a Roland act going back then, and he's behind a record called Section 25, made a record called Looking from a Hilltop with 303 in it in about 81, and that's this guy with his 303 in that record, you know. So we were aware of that equipment, and you know, and you noticed it coming into all that electro music.
Yeah.
And occasionally you got to borrow a piece of equipment or get two pieces of equipment to put together, and made an attempt at electro music. And I put one out, a re-released one a couple of years ago that I'd done in 1981 with called Chicken Skin Planet. I had an act called The Beach Surgeon back then, you know. So, you know, we were always messing around with the proto-electric, you know, synthesizer sequencey things, if you could get hold of them. But they were too expensive for us at the time, you know. They were just... they were on the expensive end of the musical equipment thing. But if somebody would lend you one, we'd have it for like 2 months and use it. And then what happened towards the end of the 80s is all this MIDI equipment came in, and all the technology became secondhand and cheap, and that point when we dove in a bit more deeply.
Yeah, because it seemed like the early rave was like dominated with like stuff like probably some kind of sampler machine, maybe an Akai, or I know those were a little bit more expensive, but
yeah, the sampler aspect of it was pretty revolutionary, but they were so expensive, the Fairlights and the Synclavier and stuff. So, but at a certain point, the first one we had was a Casio FZ1, which was probably under £1,000, and that was revolutionary,
Yeah, because like I think when I like visualize in my mind, because obviously I wasn't there, I always think, okay, like you had the Moogs, you had the Roland stuff, and then you had like some kind of like basic sampler where you could load up maybe a break beat or maybe like a vocal sample, and then you kind of just put all this stuff together. And but over time it got more complex, and that's what I kind of like about this music, is to listen to the evolution over time, because I'm sure a lot of people, when they think of 808 State, they think of Pacific 707, and that's a good song, but like your stuff kept evolving, and like I've listened to your stuff from 2002, and I think that stuff is great. It's more interesting to me to listen as an artist evolves, because they bring in all this new stuff. Like you said, you were always experimenting. So I want to know, like, when the whole thing of like computers, like being the main sequencers for music, start to become like a, standard. What was the first time that, if you did, I don't know, that you sort of worked with the computer in terms of like as a digital audio interface, as opposed to just having all these things synced up independently?
It probably wasn't until the mid 90s when I got my first Pro Tools system, which was probably the price of a car or something. It was really expensive, and that enabled the wholesale manipulation of big pieces of audio. And to me, that was like, I'd always been into tape editing previous to that. How you record music and then reorganize music was quite a fundamental idea from the start of 808 State, because we'd listened to a whole lot of Miles Davis 70s music.
Yes.
And there was a producer there who you take a record like Miles Davis in a silent way, and they record a load of music, and then they make a structure out of it, almost like editing a film, so something might repeat in the music. And that idea was entrenched, and so we'd just splurge a load of music and then form structures by editing. That was early on in 808 State. So when you got to Pro Tools, you could really go to town with that. And that was really exciting, because you had like a whole gig of hard drive. No, actually, I think it was 500 megabytes or something. That seemed enormous, because like, you could put, whole tracks in there, and that was revolutionary. An instance of using it first was when we did Don Solaris.
Yes.
1996. If you listen to the opening track on that, it's like an overture.
Yeah.
That was me messing with the Pro Tools the first time I got hold of it. Instead, like, well, I'm going to take stems from all these tracks and then make a overture to the whole album on it. And after that, that you talked about 2002, we could reshape music quite easily by that point on the Pro Tools, and you didn't have to stick to these rigid locked timelines as much. You could start pulling it apart and stretching the fabric of the music a lot more easily.
That opening of Don Solaris, it seemed like around that time, well, I guess throughout the 90s there, because like you even mentioned about an orchestra earlier, and I couldn't help but think about Massive Attack and Unfinished Sympathy.
Oh yeah,
that was like a big deal at the time, right? Because like they basically sold everything so they could have a string section in their song, and then the song became a huge hit for them. And I guess that there was always this kind of amongst the other genres sloshing around, and sort of the osmosis that was dance music in the UK. There was that like classical undertone as well as kind of mixed in with the jazzy elements, which I think make it sound that much more richer, I suppose.
Yeah, this organic thing, but a lot of the dance music of the past was incredibly organic. A lot of disco used orchestration. A lot of the soul records and stuff, so to have the richness of real strings in your arrangements is not too much of a leap, really, to bring that back, to bring that classiness to it. And again, I remember in exchanging cassettes with Bjork, one of the people we both liked was Milton Nascimento, who was a Brazilian singer. He had incredible string arrangements, really odd sounding, kind of, they didn't have a lot of violin in, they had a lot of viola in and cello. They're very rich, very chocolatey string arrangements. And this was a guy called Diodato, who was a big disco artist in the 70s. He did that 2001 funk record, the Also Sprak Zarathustra. It was like a #1 record in the UK. He produced things like Casey and the Sunshine Band. He's on some of those records. And even Earth, Wind and Fire, he does some arranging on some Earth, Wind and Fire records. But he was kind of... back in the 90s, he was kind of, I won't say he's faded away, but Bjork put him on, brought him into Post, that record Post, and had him do string arrangements for that, which makes that record so special, things like Isabel and tracks like that are brought to life by these amazing string sections. And I remember we did a gig in New York as well. Where there was this guy who was older than everyone dancing at the front of the stage when we were playing the Limelight Club in New York, and it turned out to be Diodato. We met him then, and he took us to his studio the following day, and that was amazing for people that knew those Brazilian records. It was like a real buzz to meet him back, and this would be in 92 or something like that, So it's funny, these characters thread through music like that,
The someone who I was quite surprised to hear on going back to the Don Solaris record was Mike Doughty.
Oh yeah.
I grew up with Mike Doughty, Soulcockling. I was just wondering, he's quite sort of like an alternative rock, quite raspy sounding, and it seems kind of at odds with the sort of synthetic sound you have. I was just how did that collaboration come to be?
I remember Darren and Andrew being at Glastonbury one year and seen Soulcockling, and were really blown away by them. And then they must have got talking to him at that, and the meeting came through that. We then went and saw them in Manchester when they were touring, and that's where the collaboration came from. It was just kind of they just buzzed off it, so. But to me, that kind of wordy, kind of almost cut up William Burroughs style wordiness was something that we use a whole lot in Biting Tongues from the end of the 70s to the end of the 80s. We had a singer who he wasn't a rapper and he wasn't a singer, he was a writer, and it was all about text and chopped text, and what you could do with words and chanting, and so Mike Doughty was like instantly just like, oh yeah, I know that, I know this form, and instead like, great, I'm down with that, because the one thing I didn't like in collaborating with singers is that it sometimes brought the music down to earth, whereas I always thought A28 should be really kind of not be about real life. It's a transcendental kind of experience that we're pushing for. Therefore, the choice of vocalists is important. The choice of lyrics, really, and that kind of thing. I sometimes used to struggle with it. Sometimes if we were just and some of the experiments that we did with singers. And there's quite a lot of songs that have never been put out that we tried, just because of those things. It's dead loud.
I know what you mean.
Kind of brought things down to earth. Again, that was one thing that A28 was known for a little bit, was that electronic acts didn't put singers on anything in those days, But the Bjork collaboration was really spontaneous, and it didn't seem weird, because we could see the possibilities in that. And then on Excel, we also used Bernard Sumner from New Order. And he used to come in the record store all the time and got to know Martin really well. He used to supply him with records. And it was, I think it was more or less Bernard's idea of like, oh, can I try something out on this? Because it was around that time he was trying to do stuff outside of New Order when he was doing electronic and stuff. He was up for being outside of his normal circumstances and experimenting. So that worked out great. That was... felt natural, so after that, everyone was like, who are you going to work with next, bat a lot of that away, Then, it was, we did do certain tracks with singers, I love that one with Doughty, that the Bond track. I love the words in that, and I love the with the fact that track is not typical of 808. It's something else altogether.
Yeah. It was a surprising, unexpected track, and I really enjoyed it.
In the music video too, I'm curious, like, how did that go down? Because the music and the visuals, it just fits so well. But it's like, as most music videos, of course, it's common. You don't really have context for what's going on, but I am curious to know, like, what was the kind of general spirit or ideas floating around for that music video? Because it's very interesting.
For Bond?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I was very involved in the thinking of that, so I couldn't really comment on it. The manager we had at the time, who was... she managed Tricky and Portishead at the time, but they had a film. They had a company that made videos. They produced videos, and she kind of came up with the concept and organised it all. And but I do remember it was on a deserted airfield, World War II airfield in England. And we were there for a couple of days so that we could have a wall of fire.
Yeah.
That was part of it. And I'm not sure whether the sort of tanker that he was driving, it was some sort of like tanker truck, wasn't it, or something, had all this fluid for the fire in it or something. It was all kind of budgeted to fit in, kind of thing. But the actress who was in the truck with Doughty, they actually fell in love that day and lived together for many years afterwards. It was like they met in that truck and then became an item. It was like, romance live on video.
Yeah, I can feel that. I mean, when you're an actor, and you are doing a scene like that, I mean, it's, you're still a human being. So like that chemistry you develop, I can go all sorts of directions. That's interesting. Yeah, I never knew that. Very interesting.
But I was never particularly, I don't think we ever we weren't strong in videos. If we had been a little bit more attentive to the videos and, MTV kind of thinking, it would have benefited us a lot. I think that's one place where we fell down. A lot of the time back then, you would make a video and the only outlets for that video in the UK would be a program called The Chart Show, it was called. And that's the only place you could get that video shown. And to us, it's like, oh, do you want to spend, 50 grand on a video that might get on that program? It just seemed ridiculous. It's like, no, I'd rather keep the money. It was very unlikely that we would get it on MTV because MTV, there was certain doorways into MTV. We just weren't an MTV band. But then again, you see videos by The Prodigy and Aphex Twin that really made those, took them up such a level that we never did, and that we should have been a bit more on it with that, or, taken better advice on it. Because we always cut corners on videos and none of it stands up. None of the videos really age well, for 808 State.
I mean, like I said, the Bond one I think is interesting, and some of your others, even though it is kind of dated, when I look at that stuff, it still has a strong aesthetic component to it, because I feel like all your music, I'm a very visual person anyway, so when I make music, when I get a certain beat in my mind, it's like, okay, I sort of imagine the aesthetic visuals for it. When I listen to your music, I feel the same way. There's always a strong visual component. That's what, when you're talking about really being an album band, I think that's what's really cool, is being able to listen to the stuff in the context album with the, art. It all sort of coalesces into one. And I think that, it would have been cool to see more visual and more kind of abstract, kind of that futuristic design that was popular in the 90s. Because when I hear your music, I just think of this real kind of sleek, futuristic design with the vector graphics and the.
I think one strong part of we did get the artwork for our records kind of right. We worked with some good people there. And the titling of everything was something, made up titles that weren't really words. That was there was an aesthetic in that. And it's like when you go on to bands like Autechre, do you know that group from? They're from round here. And the way they started making titles out of almost like computer keyboard mistakes and things, it's almost like a follow-on from how we started, like a new syntax for a new music, because you wanted to be oblique and take it away from normal life again. It's like it is new, it is a new future, and therefore you have to have a new syntax and a new visual language to go with it. But I kind of stopped at videos though. But I'm still proud of all the artwork and the work that went into presenting the records as packages, and that's kind of frustrating at the moment to do releases that are only digital. These ones we've been doing in recent weeks, there's no physical version of them, and that's a bit frustrating for a person like me because I like the packaging.
Yeah.
In fact, the record we did in 2019, Transmission Suite, has really amazing packaging and a story behind it. And I'm so chuffed with the package on that, but unfortunately it didn't get distributed very well. And I have a lot of them in my basement currently waiting for when we go on tour. So hopefully it's a lovely object, you know, double vinyl fold out kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing the music scene that I sort of got into, vaporwave.
All right.
A big thing with that was the fact that so much of it was distributed through cassettes, and there were whole like communities on Facebook, people who would collect cassettes. I don't have a lot, but there's this one particular artist. I've been to his show at least once. Hope to do it again. George Clanton, in fact, though, he has like you know, album art that's it's very much like world building, which I really love in music.
Yeah. Yeah.
That reminds me as well. Have you heard of there's a music genre called New Monkey?
No, not heard of that.
So it's really big in Newcastle, and so if you spend time in Newcastle, eventually there'll be someone who drives by in a car and they're blasting New Monkey music out. So it's basically it's a Spanish sort of hard style, fast paced techno called Maquina.
Right.
And it's got a Geordie guy just shouting over the top of it. I went to a record shop in Newcastle recently, and I found there was just this corner full of New Monkey CDs and tapes. So I bought. Sorry.
There's a section already in the records.
Yeah. It's a very small section, and it's got all this. It extends into sort of donk music, sort of Wigan Pier, and stuff. So it's all like locally produced. So I bought a 6 CD collection and another CD, and I tried them in several CD players. I also tried them in the PlayStation, and they just didn't work.
Damn.
Oh.
It feels like maybe I don't have the right sort of CD player. Maybe it's not old enough.
It could be maybe it's data that you have to download onto, you know, get a computer with a CD attached, and maybe it's pure data or something. I don't know.
It could be. This is just a thought. I know some, like for instance, like some newer artists who put out like tracks, they actually do them on DVDs. So you need like a dual layer DVD player to read it. I don't know if that's the case there, but that's just a shot in the dark on my end.
Yeah, I tried playing it on a PlayStation. But yeah, I won't give up.
Before we take our break here, you know, in the beginning and during the whole, you know, second summer of love, was there ever like a realization that like this music could become real big on an international level? Did you ever have that sense, or?
Yeah, I think it always felt like one of the first international genres in a way, because it was almost a dialogue between, there's a transatlantic dialogue, because we loved all the American import music. The first time we went to Detroit to play a gig in Detroit, we were kind of had an idea that America knew about its own music, you know, and when we went there, we realized how colloquial that music was in America, from an American perspective, because it was so dearly loved in our country, you know.
Yeah.
and all the Detroit techno stuff. And eventually it's got its recognition. But when we first went over in about 1990, it didn't have its recognition in the place it came from almost. And so, you know, there was this dialogue of records coming into the record shop, and you know, the British versions of that, of techno and stuff, were then making an impact in America. You know, we were on Tommy Boy in America, which was a hip hop label that had been established 10 years earlier. You know, and that was a big deal for us to be on Tommy Boy, because a lot of the historic records that they had, you know, to be amongst those records was amazing for us, you know. But those records were getting some airplay in, depending on where the radio stations were. When we first went on tour in America, it'd be like feast or famine, you know, there'd be no one there, or it'd be a massive rave. You know, we went and did a massive rave in Long Beach in 1990, or was it 90? Might be 91, 1990, in the exhibition center there, and that was due to one radio station on the West Coast, Mars FM. And there was a radio station in Hawaii that played a lot of our music, you know, and therefore we got to go in and doing almost like a few days in Hawaii kind of thing, based on the fact that that radio station played us, you know. And but, you know, then in other parts of America, we were considered almost put under a thing like an industrial band or something, you know, like Front 242 or Depeche Mode and all that kind of. It's like we're kind of like,
because like we had another guest on here a while back. He goes by the name Flapjack the Candy Kid, and he's big into happy hardcore. And he was talking about how the first time he went to a rave in like Europe, he was surprised to see like a lot of older dudes there that were just like really enjoying the music and getting down to it. And, you know, these guys, you know, like you wouldn't expect that same crowd in America, because it's like back in the 90s, like raves and all that stuff in America was seen as kind of odd. You know, it seemed like the musical influences was like rock and rap music in the US. So rave was kind of like, people didn't really know what to think of it. And of course, obviously dubstep and all that kind of, you know, just absorbed, not even just dubstep, but just like EDM, all this stuff kind of got absorbed into a sort of a corporate landscape. But I feel like it took longer in the US because it took a while to come back over here.
We could see that, you know, every time we went back to America, things had changed. You know, the rave thing had flared up in various places. Texas, for instance, was a real big place for our music back then. You know, and you could do like raves in Texas. Again, it was based around a radio show. But, you know, when you went back maybe a year and a half later, the audience demographic was loads younger. And, you know, it was almost like a teenage thing all of a sudden. And the rock connection, be it the college radio connection, had sort of come undone a little bit. And it became its own kind of universe as the 90s went on, you know. And then this is pre-EDM, but, you know, what they call candy ravers and all that kind of thing.
There's something I remember in that podcast with Flapjack the Candy Kid. He was saying that you know, with happy hardcore in America, it's got this very light-hearted feeling to it, and it's mostly a sort of younger audience. But then when he came to the UK, he was really surprised to see that I can't remember what the word he used to describe it. It was like it wasn't blokey, but we're going to say blokey, just sort of these really aggressive dudes.
Yes.
Oh yeah, he said dudes. That was it.
Oh, it's mosh pitty kind of.
Yes.
Yeah, people trying to fight with each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think New Monkey is, going back to New Monkey, is it's like that happy hardcore sort of style, but from the perspective of these really angry blokes.
Right.
Yeah, that's funny.
So there's a frustration in it. You know, there's a, is it pandemic venting music?
Possibly. It's been going before then, but yeah, you just guys driving around in cars blasting it out really loud.
Oh, right.
It's funny. We're gonna go to a quick 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to ask a few more questions and get an idea what's in Graham's future, and then I think we'll wrap it up. So we're gonna shoot for a 10-minute break. Does that sound good?
Right. I'll make a cup of tea then.
Yeah.
All right. See you then.
See you soon.
Welcome back to the World Movers podcast. I'm here with my co-host Rubarcode and our guest Graham. And when we last left off, we were sort of talking about the various sort of scenes and styles and music, dance music in the UK, and particularly how it was received by American audiences. And one thing that has always been central to me in relation to rave has been the fashion. And I'm curious for you, Graham, as somebody who participated in this culture, what was it like in regards to kind of like watching the evolution of rave fashion? And what did you sort of, I guess, think about it? What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, because it was kind of quite an instant change in about 1988 in the nightclubs, because as the nightclubs were suddenly really crowded, really about non-stop dancing, you didn't put your best clothes on.
Right.
You put clothes on that were comfortable, and that's there was the whole thing about the baggy fashion, in particularly in Manchester. And there was some people who made clothes who picked up on it early on. A company called Joe Bloggs was one, and another company called Gi Goy, who used to give all the movers and shakers, the bands and the key figures, they used to supply them clothes, so you would go to their warehouse and they would go pick what you want. And that included all the bands from Manchester at that point. So all of a sudden, everyone from the Inspiral Carpets, James, the Happy Mondays, New Order, were all wearing the same gear, within weeks of each other. And it must have had an effect on the whole what people were buying in the shops. It was a good move on the manufacturers, kind of good marketing. But then again, the fashion thing in Manchester at that time became very DIY.
Yes.
There was a huge boost in clothes making in Manchester. Many of the marketplaces and the places where the record shops and the clothes shops and the poster paraphernalia, were setting up stalls, actually running up clothes to go out dancing in, and they looked quite amateur. They were really baggy. A club like the Thunderdome, it was quite hilarious because people actually used to get their mum's sewing machines out, and it looked like the most basic of clothes making. It's almost Stone Age, I would say.
Yeah.
and the hats and all that kind of thing. It occurred very fast. And we weren't quite sure whether it was happening all over the country, but it seemed to be. London kind of didn't go down as quickly as the rest of the country, in terms of that look, because London operates at a different speed, I think. But some of that stuff came through the football fashions, particularly in places like Manchester with the football. The two teams in Manchester, very big clubs, Manchester United, Manchester City. There was a fashion consciousness that went towards sportswear in those. But this was really led by the Liverpool clubs as well. The Liverpool clubs were known for a sense of identity through the clothes they wore, the shoes they wore, things like kicker shoes that became adopted by the rave thing. And even the bucket hat thing probably came from the football culture first. And there was this merging of the ecstasy culture with the football culture that I remember at the time, because I lived near Manchester City's ground, and something went really odd on a Saturday when people were taking inflatable bananas to the match. You know, it was like not just a few people, but everyone. So on a Saturday afternoon, people walking past my house all carrying 6-foot inflatable bananas. It was like it just happened overnight, and it was like it went on for about a year. And that was a part of a rave ecstasy football mashup that I didn't understand at the time. Well, I still don't understand it, but the again, it was a sort of an evening out of like a working class culture thing in Manchester. You aspired, clothes buying had always been this aspirational, important part of the culture, you know, to buy certain items from golfing shops, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, specific items, and that got melted into the rave culture. But the biggest uniform probably was the long sleeve T-shirt back then, because they didn't exist before then. You know, it's like with kind of slogans and artwork that went down the sleeves, as well as on the back and the front. There were some very popular ones in Manchester. One called "Born in the North, Live in the North, Die in the North" was a big seller. They're very collectible now. A lot of these old rave shirts now go for like silly money on the internet, and I've got a whole museum of them upstairs. You know, in from going to raves and doing gigs and stuff. That you know, they should put them on display somewhere, I think.
Yeah, you should.
There's a clothing museum in Manchester that does stuff way back to past Victorian times, and we're quite honoured to have a Quadrastate, which was one of our early records, long sleeve hoodie in the clothing museum in Manchester. So we're very, very proud of that.
Graham, what football team do you support?
I'm not really a big football person, but you know, I think in Manchester you are branded with it from an early age. So I'm a Red. I'm United.
Okay, yeah.
And my son is an avid United fan. It's quite interesting at the moment that Manchester City are using 808 States In Your Face as their coming on music, and have been doing for a couple of years now.
All right.
Yeah, so it should be the other team doing that.
That's funny.
Because
I don't really understand football.
Yeah, 808 all red. Yeah, we're all. Whereas it's not very popular to support the Reds as much as the Blues. Most of the musicians in Manchester are Blues supporters. So.
Did you ever feel pressure to dress in the sort of rave style, or?
No, because back then I mean, I can think of times when a box of clothes would arrive. You know, there is some horrible shots of us at an early 808 State gig where they gave us a load of cycling gear, you know, like Lycra. And it's like everyone just gamely got into it, and instead like, oh, that was a mistake, and look at us all, that kind of thing, you know. But you know, if anything was free back then, we were from like a sort of background where anything, you know, we would pick up anything that was, you know, given to you, you know. We weren't but you got to remember that we weren't trying to separate ourselves from the crowd. The interesting thing about the rave thing was the non-separation, the non-performance element, the fact that if you were on a stage, the audience was on the stage as well. You know, you got that at like Happy Mondays gigs where the stage was invaded by relatives, people they knew, kids, you know. There was no borders anymore. There was a breaking down of that us and them culture, and we represented everyone in the audience as much as, you know, it wasn't an elevated star status system, it was a breakdown of that as well, you know.
Yeah.
Went along with the clubbing culture at the time, you know. It was very I don't know what the word is, but
Inclusive, or
yeah, but it's the lack of division.
Yeah.
So it was all utilitarian.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't about showing off. That would be considered odd, you know, in that circumstance. And later on, as clubbing became much more serious business, you know, we took more interested in buying clothes, you know, and you know, say we're doing a TV thing, you know, we'd all go out as a gang and go and buy clothes. In fact, there's quite an interesting clip of MC Tunes on YouTube off in Manchester buying clothes at that time, going around all the shops, and it's quite interesting that you're allowed to smoke over the clothes back then.
I agree.
You know, yeah, picking things up and puffing cigarettes all over them. And because some people, yeah, there was a lot of money made in clothes back then. You know, there was a lot of a boost to the clothing economy, definitely, because fashion's changed so much. You know, and there was a look towards the Balearic thing in England, which is like the Spanish islands, where a lot of the culture of the rave movement came from that Mediterranean looseness.
Ibiza.
Yeah. So a lot of it was a cheap holiday if you were like in England at the time. You know, you could go there relatively cheap for 2 weeks, and the clubbing culture really soaked in to the working class people in Manchester, that they wanted to almost recreate that in the clubs like the Hacienda and the Thunderdome. You know, and this question of like, is it Balearic is like a trope now, but it was a thing of like, you know, certain indie records could be included in the night if they were considered Balearic, you know, for instance, like the Wooden Tops or something, you know, certain records that had a beat under them. And certainly we got ensconced in making indie bands sound more clubby. And that started early, you know, and, you know, so you would get a record. I did remixes for people like the Shaman, who weren't established. They were more of an indie thing when they were, you know, pretty established sort of indie band, and they turned a corner, you know, and I did remixes for them, and we did remixes for James. I don't think that one ever came out, but Andy Weatherall's version of Come Home became a big Balearic anthem. Another one I did was Don't Fight It, Feel It, Primal Scream. Again, Andy Weatherall was on the other side of that. And, you know, I was always, I wouldn't say I was in competition with Andy Weatherall, but he had this annoying habit of like doing really fucking amazing mixes that eclipsed whatever you were doing at the time. And both did Papua New Guinea by Future Sound of London.
Oh, yeah.
And so at one point we were the go-to indie remixers, you know, of 1990, 91 kind of thing. Yeah, so there was a lot of that going on, of like update my, you know, introducing established bands into the club thing, you know, yeah, and we did some quite weird remixes early on as well. One was by a guy called John Hassel, who died recently.
I know, I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah, he was like a king of ambient music. He had a thing called Third World Music that did an amazing album with Brian Eno called Possible Musics. That was a big influence for me as a teenager. So it was amazing to get a request from John Hassel. You know, I was absolutely over the moon about that. And that was one of our early remixes. And then a strange, I'm trying to think, this German record, and it was kind of all called Mohammed, and it was kind of all in Arabic, that we did a 303 remix of very early on. And yeah, you didn't know what you were going to get. And remixing was a great platform for us to experiment, you know, to get a day in the studio, because studio time was expensive. If someone was going to pay for a day in the studio, you were really ramped up to try and make something creative out of it in a day. You know, that focus was really welcome, you know, and you could do things, take risks in remixing. You're always expected to go out on a limb and do something quite radical with a remix, you know. So it was a great stretching process doing remixes early on.
Hey, you know, and it's interesting you mentioned about remix culture, because you mentioned about punk, and another element to dance music back then was also dub music, and Jamaican dub music, like that whole ethos of, like, you know, basically chopping up tapes and dubbing them and all that stuff. From what I understand, very influential to a lot of dance music as well.
It was a very big, when growing up in the 70s in Manchester, it was the party music of the city, you know.
Yeah.
Though, you know, it was the sort of music, the most important social music, covered all bases. It was acceptable by all groups of people.
Interesting.
And the dub aspect of it really did seep into your thinking when you got into a studio, because the use of effects and things like that. But just before we formed 808 State, we were really into, both me and Martin were really into a producer called Adrian Sherwood, who was did a lot of work with reggae artists, but he also worked with the Sugar Hill Gang. Wow. And then did this kind of fusion of sort of New York funk with dub reggae, and they had this label called On You Sound, and that music was really influential on us, because they went around doing sound systems, but in a new way, in a sort of in a way where they played everything off cassettes, and it was all from one producer. So they could spin a whole night of 4 hours, but it all sounded cohesive and extreme, and amazing players on it, you know, Doug Wimbush and Skip MacDonald. And yeah, it's worth looking into the Adrian Sherwood stuff, because Warp have recently reissued a lot of his stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they were a real influence. It's like, oh, we want to do this. Yeah, we could do it as a sound system. When we first used to do 808 State with all the electronic boxes, the idea was that we did it all at the DJ booth. You know, we didn't perform on stage. We just performed at where the mixing desk was, like the On You sound system did. You know, it's like the division between the DJ and the band and the engineer was all blurred.
Yeah.
You know, it was all about dub, and it was all about how many effects boxes you could get hold of, and how messed up you could make the music. Because I was a live sound engineer at a club called the Boardwalk in Manchester, and I used to get told off constantly for like putting echo on everything. You know, bands used to comment on it. So like, can you take the echo box off him?
Yeah, it's like, listen to dub music, and then you'll understand.
Yeah.
Well, the SPX 90 was the mangle box of the day, you know, so we used to put everything through a harmonizer. You know, people didn't like that. Certain bands did, but you know, we used to get 3 bands a night there, all different kinds of music. You know, you might get, you know, something like Lieback or the Lemonheads, or you know, it's like it was a conveyor belt of all kinds of bands. American bands, British bands, European bands that went through that club that you had to engineer every night, you know. And Actually, I didn't do it a lot. I did it periodically, you know, but it was a baptism of fire, and it was a chance to stretch your engineering skills, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like fertile ground in a way for you as an artist yourself, because you're just taking in all these diverse sounds. And that's one thing that I notice about like dance music from that time is the convergence of a lot of ideas. And also, like you said, the gear and the equipment was becoming cheaper for people to own. The first time you had people who were getting on the ground level who were really able to experiment in a way that previously would have cost them, you know, probably as much as a car to do.
It was an elite thing, you know, to be in a recording studio, because like most bands visited a recording studio, it would cost, you know, £500, £1,000, you know, which was way out of most people's budget.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were at the mercy of somebody who was probably quite straight as an engineer, you know.
Yes.
You know, come from a tradition of making sure, almost like a offspin of, like, you know, when you talk about the Beatles going in Abbey Road and then having to break that system down in order to make creative records. But as we reached the sort of into the 80s and the advent of digital technology, you know, I was around at the time when people like Martin Hannett were in the studios in Manchester and using all this new digital equipment. As there was a lot of ideas that spun from those, you know, because some of the first sampling we did was on these echo boxes where you could capture, you know, 1.5 seconds, you could trap, you know, a little thing in it, and we'd feed cassettes into that and you know, trap little bits of samples and textures, and you know, the economy of how much you could sample was really small, but you made a lot out of it, you know. And yeah, the studio was a sacred space for me, you know, because you would be in rehearsal rooms all the time and it didn't sound like records, it sounded too human, and it sounded, you know, but the minute you got in a studio, you could make it sound any way you wanted, you know. Yeah, and make it sound more like the records you were into, you know. Say, you know, you listen to a lot of things like Prince back then. It was like, you know, a lot of ideas going on in his records in terms of sound, how to squash things and, you know, make space in them and stuff that was very exciting if you could try and do that, you know, to the music that you could make with your friends, you know. So yeah, the studio became a very important part of 808 State because we had access all of a sudden, because I was doing this engineering course at this studio, and I was basically the caretaker. So a lot of our sessions were overnight when no one was in, or if there was any spare time, we could take over.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned Prince. Did you know Prince made a house track?
Well, I imagine he made a few, didn't he? I don't know.
To my knowledge, the one that he made is called The Human Body. Yeah, it's like an industrial house track. When I heard it, it was so weird because it's like I knew it was him, but it's just like a kind of a totally different style than I was used to from him. And
all right, I can imagine him like being, you know, a night owl person out in clubs that he could only respond. You know, he'd have to respond to what was going on in those clubs at that time. You know, I mean, you hear those things like Little Louis records, and I always think they're really Prince influenced. There's an element of I don't know which way round it is even. Do you know what I mean? Whether he came first, you know, or, you know, there's the same sort of cartoon world there, you know. He had a massive hit called French Kiss. That was a massive Hacienda tune. French Kiss was like, you know, an anthem. But his more interesting stuff is like, you know, he made loads of 12 inches. And it's got this real post-apocalyptic vibe on them. and he's very, he addresses relationship things in his thing, but in a very kind of fictional way. He's worth checking out. Yeah.
But yeah, just getting back to your music, this album that's been on hold, like what's sort of the future for you and going forward with that?
Yeah, the tour that got postponed is just about to happen, actually. So starting in a couple of weeks, we're going to be out every weekend doing a tour of the UK. And that goes through till November. So we'll be out and about doing the tour we should have done. And that includes quite a lot of the new material that we wrote in 2019. And, we do, about an 80-minute show, and it encompasses, quite a lot of the hits and stuff, as well as stuff we're trying out. It's quite hard, actually, when you're doing an album, you're just doing an album. And then once you put it as a stage thing and you have to fit the new music with the old music, there's a certain, like, does that fit here? Does that fit there? It's hard to, you don't write to put it in the live set. And maybe, that will be a good thing to do, but it stops the creative process if you start thinking that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's always a bit of crowbarring in, and things that you think would work don't work, and then things that seemed almost a bit inconsequential do really work. It's an interesting process to find out. So we did do a few gigs as we were recording that record, and try the music out. So I think we know what we're doing now. So
good.
So but in the, I've also been doing, during the pandemic, there's quite a few remixes that I've been doing that haven't come out yet. And so everything seems to take a lot longer these days, and I think it might be something to do with the pressing plants and the backlog of everything that, occasionally you're quite surprised of, like, oh yeah, I did that a year ago or whatever, and then it pops up. There's some recent ones. There was a Go Go Penguin remix. Have you heard of that band?
Yeah, I'm a fan.
Yeah, because they were in the same building as us when we were recording the last album, and they used to come in and look at the synths. They were like, oh, can we look at the gear, kind of thing. And we got to know each other through just being in the same building, and that's how that remix came about. And really pleased with that one. And it's in good company as well. There's a lot of really good remixes on a remix album there. And quite a lot of the same remixes have just done another band from Manchester called Henge, which you might have heard of.
No, I haven't.
Oh, right. Well, Henge, they seem to be really wowing the festivals over the past 3 summers. They're a bit cosmic in a, almost, they kind of got a backstory of, it's almost Hawkwind-like, in that they're sort of they've got almost like they present their records with a comic book, and each one has a character name. Each one band member has a character name, and it's quite space rock,
Yeah.
And it works brilliantly at festivals, and I felt really at home remixing them. So that's not come out yet. I think that's due soon. But as far as like 808, we're trying to pull back a lot of the stuff with, I don't know next summer whether a lot of the things that got cancelled we automatically get rebooked on or not. I'm not sure. We have to build up to next summer, which is where a lot of the work is, in terms of going out doing festivals, because that's the buzz really is quite like doing the festivals and
Yeah.
playing to people that aren't necessarily new, it's playing to new people that don't know the history, and you have to play, the music has to work, despite not knowing anything about it. I think that's the thrill of that, that you can win new people over, that the music is solid enough to make an impact on anyone from a 12-year-old to a, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you don't have to have lived through the culture to like our music,
The thing is, music is a gateway drug because it may lead to people wanting to find out about the culture.
Yeah, and that's fine because it's all there, and it's all quite documentary. Spent a lot of time trying to write that history down over the pandemic. We've been releasing a single a week, and I've done almost like sleeve notes for each record. And you can find that on our website, 808state.com, or on our Facebook and Instagram. That I've done a write-up of where we were, what we were thinking, and why we made this record and that record. Trying to kind of explain it to the context in a way, because I think when I read about music, I always want to go and listen to it, as a sort of avid reader of music history, you just throw a little bit of light on it, and then you've got a way in, because there's such a lot of music available that why should it's almost like you need a little foothold to get into it.
Yeah, exactly. Like to know like the context of the collaborations at the time. Like just for me, like knowing about how influential Ibiza was to a lot of groups, especially in the UK, it's kind of funny to me because like, I grew up here in Southern California. So like the visuals of like, palm trees and all that, that's like something I've just grown up around. But, you and my co-host Rubarco both live in a very different climate. That's not always the most. It's definitely useful if you're making like certain type of music, but if you're looking for like something that's kind of more tropical or Mediterranean, you won't find it at that latitude. But the ironic thing is you guys sort of brought it in, kind of import that back into the UK, and it became
it's not almost to dream it. You have to and the music is very often about dreaming something, to imagine it and make it materialize through music. What is over the horizon, and it's something I've always found with music. A lot of the music I really like is about something that's over the horizon, like some made up. We're talking about John Hassel before, and he had this concept of fourth world music, which is like not, sort of music that's kind of beyond the it's not an actual place. It's not like it's China or India. It's like, but it is exotic.
Sort of aspirational.
That's very much an 808 thinking kind of thing. And I would say that one of my favorite groups growing up, and again, you might call it prog, but I don't, it is Weather Report, who did something similar to that. They made these a music that didn't have a land, but you knew it wasn't, it was a made up land. And the use of synthesizers and sonics were really influential on the way I thought, when I got hold of synthesizers. They were my leading influence as to, how to use synthesizers, much more than say, Giorgio Moroder or something like that, But that's why I get these sort of prog label-y things, or even sort of muso-y things, but it's not about how skilled they are. It's about color. It's about texture. It's about building
Yeah.
something to get lost in, you know.
When I first heard Miles Davis, it definitely sounded like very ahead of its time. And I haven't listened to Weather Report, but I do see that he's one of the people who was involved or associated with it. So
Yeah.
that's interesting because, too, it's like the world music aspect there. You know, it seemed like in the 90s, you had a convergence between, like, you know, the dudes who had like a lot of money to spend on, like, not the synclavier, but what's the other one? The emu.
Fairlight.
Yeah, Fairlight emus. Because Peter Gabriel was somebody who was early on with the whole like world beat, and Herbie Hancock was another one. So you had that kind of stuff, but those guys were all established. But then it's like in the the early 90s, suddenly now people kind of had this realization, hey, we have samplers now, we can just pretty much do the same thing as them. And then like along with that, then you had like Enigma taking kind of world beat stuff and mixing that with the dance music that was coming up. And so it just all sort of loops back, as it were. And now you've got people who are somewhat, who have more like high-end equipment, but they're also mixing in a lot of stuff that's, been a main staple for up and coming, producers and stuff from the dance music scene where they didn't have a lot of money, stuff like the 909s. And now you're hearing a 909 with like some sort of ambient pad sound from some like really expensive synth. And it's just kind of crazy.
Well, I can't emphasize enough how important Miles Davis's music was to the thinking of 808 States Records, as far as I'm concerned. Because, you were dealing with something that didn't have a form that was about verse, chorus, or links back to, I mean, you can follow Miles Davis back to the blues, but I mean, by the 70s, there wasn't much of a trace of that. And it was the fact that they were playing polytonally and polyrhythmically, this huge mesh of music that was so affecting for me that, when we went into acid house, it felt very similar. It felt like a tangle of tones, and, we didn't even tune the instruments, a lot of the time, and it was just this sort of the tangle that was important, and the layers and the way the rhythms crossed each other, and the complexity of, you take our first record, New Build, which is not as simple as Chicago Acid House, which was very 4/4 simple. This was kind of a bit more meshed up, it was kind of polyrhythmic in places, doing funny time signatures, and it was the density was different, but that's a and then that carries on through a lot of 808's work. That it's almost a blueprint for, in some ways, is that sort of Miles Davis sound of the 70s, of all the wah-wah stuff. I'm trying to think. It's that density cuts through a lot of the 808 stuff. But then he'd do, interesting stuff with the keyboards, and warm washes and textures. But there's all the spin-off bands, like I'm saying, that came from that Herbie Hancock. We all listened to Headhunters, Weather Report, Chick Corea stuff, and all those warm textures, road sounds and things like that. We were, the minute we got hold of things that could do that, we were all over it. It was all kind of like, oh, we can, here's the paint palette that we've been waiting for, because the paint palette before that was guitars and drums and bass, and,
exactly.
You could definitely sort of meld the sound to what you want with synthesizers, and I really like the New Build album. It's sort of like compulsively squelchy.
Yeah, it's not sensible, is it?
No, and I can definitely see the inspiration from Miles Davis, as you said, with the wah wah sounds. It makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, oh, we're going to do that, but it was just the fact it was kind of once you're in it, it's like, oh yeah, this is more me than some of those like house records that were all about jacking and had gospel influences in. That didn't feel like my world, that felt like somebody else's history. Whereas like the alien quality of acid house suddenly felt that it talked to what I like to listen to on a daily basis. And people forget also that growing up in the 70s as well, it's like on a daily basis, we were listening to things like Cabaret Voltaire, Throbbing Gristle, all those industrial noise bands, isn't it? It's like music, concrete, kind of just noise for, how to paint in noise. And this was not a brand new idea. It was going on, and it was part of our. If you went to, we once did a 24-hour Throbbing Gristle party because my mate had they put out a attache case with 24 tapes of 24 gigs, and we had a bet to do the 24 hours, so it's quite formative stuff, in terms of like messing with noise and noise as music. And then, but the difference is that, groove and dancing was incredibly to the fore, because we were going out clubbing so much, and that was now the focus, because if you got hold of a 909, instead like you're talking the same language, instead like right now we this record will fit in with that record, and what we you're in, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it was an international Esperanto, the sonic palette of the Roland equipment was dead like, it could be from Italy, could be from America, could be from Japan. It was all the same sounds expressed in a different way. I mean, things like Yellow Magic Orchestra were like, those records were big in Manchester, right in Lagos, Sakamoto, those records. And they were great at color and texture as well, and they were doing interesting new records that they were early 80s as well, so there's a lot of stuff that led up to the whole history of electronic music that went before the house thing. And we played a lot of house gigs back then, and it was more to do with, we'd play weekenders that were to do with the soul music scene, there's a thing called Northern Soul in Britain, where you're aware of that scene, where it was about dancing all night and taking amphetamines and staying up, and just it was definitely a dancer's culture, and about finding the rare obscure B-sides and all that kind of thing, But house music butted up against that when it started, because that's where it lived. So we'd be going and doing concerts at those holiday camps, and there'd be us and Adamski and Guru Josh. There was very few people trying to do it live then, and we'd be the same people all the time, and it was hated by that culture, instead like, oh, we're not having, it was rejected, quite early on. It was a battle to establish a UK version of house music with these new ideas,
Yeah, it's really interesting to trace the genesis of a lot of the music that came to the UK, and then to like watch seeing like advertisements from like Japan in the late 90s and hearing like drum and bass music and like those advertisements. And it's like, it kind of takes it full circle because it's like, here's equipment like Roland stuff and other things. They came from Japan, then they went to America, then they went to the UK, came back to America, and then went back to Japan and elsewhere, of course, as well. But
yeah, it was literally ricocheting
yeah,
around the globe.
and that was happening before the internet, which I think is just fascinating because we take all that stuff for granted today because it's just like, well, yeah, that's like conceivable. But back then, you know, it was very different. How was a way that you would like, or did you like communicate with like international or like international lines? I guess like communicate with other people. Like, how was that?
We had a fax machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know, because we went to Japan quite early on. And, you know, once we got the album 90 out, one of the first places we went was Japan. And I don't know how that got set up, probably through the record company.
I see. Yeah, true.
But because they would have a branch in Japan, you know, because though we were on ZTT Records, well, that was distributed through Warner Brothers. So it would be put on the table at Warner Brothers as a new act. And therefore, yeah, it probably got organized that way. But I remember we went on the plane, and also Blur were on the plane, actually. They were quite a young act at that point. And Japan was a very, you know, it's kind of, you didn't know how it would go. And we played in a department store, you know, it's quite a small gig. But we did meet the guys from Roland, or Boss, as it was, actually a representative came to the gig, presented us with presents. And one of the presents was a tape that the people from the factory had made in their lunch hour of some of our music.
Oh, wow.
Like a cover version. And that was just so sweet.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I think we got like a Boss watch or something, you know, like some gifts like that. You know, and people were just so sweet in Japan, like this gift giving thing. Yeah. And then like another time we went back the second time, and Harumi Hosono, who's one of the lead guys from Yellow Magic Orchestra, came to the concert, and he presented us with a gift and everything, and there was some ceremony about it. And then the whole audience, some guy made an announcement from the stage, and the whole audience turned to the balcony and bowed to Mr. Hosono on the balcony, you know, and it was like, this is crazy stuff, you know. But held in such respect, the Yellow Magic Orchestra were huge in Japan, you know. And it was almost like tipping his hat to us was such an honor, you know, to be, So, yeah, it was very organic. And, you know, we to look back on it now, you know, you get a look at it through rose-tinted glasses kind of thing.
True, yeah.
But like you say, it was pre-internet, and therefore everything had a gravity to it, you know, if you actually managed to get there, you know. And yeah, we've been very lucky, you know, because it was like surfing in a way, you know, this big wave of the rave thing came in, and we just surfed that wave in, you know, and we're in the right place at the right time with the right gear, you know.
Yeah. What advice would you give to somebody, electronic music producer, just starting out now? Then, because I think it's much harder to make things that sound new as well.
True.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to know where you're making this record for, you know, if you do have a club that's going off that you attend, and you get a sense of the music that gets played there, I think that's important. There's a club in Manchester that last time I DJ'd before the pandemic, you know, I had a slot, and I was like, well, I need to make some music for this, you know, and I knew exactly what to make for that situation. And that, you know, that's important. I think, like, I can think of certain clubs in Manchester now where they've got their own vibe going on, and you just think small, think colloquial, think your mates, you know, don't try and conquer the world all at once, you know, and try and make all things to all people. I think you've got to start with, does this mean anything to me? Can I play it my friend? Will I get a response? You know, are we vibing? You know, it's got to start small and grow outwards. You know, not try and hit all the history of everything that's gone on. You know what I mean? It's like it's hard to encompass everything.
Yeah.
And I get lost in it. I get lost in it because I'm carrying all this baggage, you know.
True.
But the actual thrill of just coming up with a cheeky little groove and a cheeky little something that amuses you, you know, or makes you get up and dance in the kitchen, you know, is still the most important thing, you know. Just that's that's nice kind of thing, you know, because like 80% of the time that won't happen, you know, because you're just chundering away on the computer and you're searching and you're searching. But occasionally, if you switch everything off and you're just in a vibe and you're just sort of having fun is really important, you know, just trying to get to that is crucial, I think, you know, because that's what we were doing back then. It was just a load of energy in a room that came out that way.
And you just sort of trying things, what works, what doesn't.
Yeah, you kind of know instantly within 10 minutes. You know, something there you have to really, if you've been on it all day and it's not happening, it's not going to happen, I don't think. You know, if you jump on it,
I do that as well.
Yeah. If you just jump on the computer and it's suddenly like, ooh, something there, you know. And there's a temptation now, of course, to put it away and come back to it later, which I think is back then when everything was expensive, we had to finish it.
Yeah, true.
You know, when you were doing remixes, it's like you got a day, you know, and it's you've got to go in, prepare it, sort it, finish it in a day. And it was like there's something really good about that. I mean, there's maybe, you know, a load of duds from that. You know, there's some remixes I can't listen to because it fell short, you know, but some of the energy really carries through on those situations. I kind of miss that thing with modern computers where you just go, I'll come back to that later, because like I've got stuff sitting on the computer that's like, you know, 15 years old that I still like and I still play, but it's not finished. You know what I mean?
I feel the same way. Yeah. I'm curious, when you guys came to the US for the first time, how was just like a Brit coming to America? How was that like? Because
like the first place we came was New York, and that's complicated. I've written about it recently in these notes I was mentioning, and what I remember, the Empire State Building was on fire that day.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and it was said like, wow, this is bizarre, you know. But we got taken round by the guy from the record company. It was he knew New York like the back of his hand in terms of clubs, and you would get taken round to meet the Italians, and then you would get taken around all the gay nightclubs, and which is where a lot of our music was established. You know, Tom, our A&R guy, that was his natural habitat. You know, on why the remixes he chose fitted these clubs, you know, because he A&R'd some of the remixes on Tommy Boy. And when I first heard them, it's like, oh, I really don't get this, you know. And then you saw it in context, and it's like, oh, I totally get it, you know. And, you know, he'd take us to see the Latinos, and, you know, they were all kind of separate camps, you know, back then. This was like 89, 90.
Right.
And it became different over the years, but back then New York was sectored, you know. It was kind of like postcoded, you know. So yeah, it was very exciting. But then once we got out, you know, as I was saying, we'd get flown over because we did a big rave, and that would pay for the rest of it. You know, you were out there then you could like join up the dots. So a lot of the time we'd end up in some club in the middle of nowhere that really wasn't interested in this rave thing. But then you made an impact, you know, because it was like something brand new, you know, in somewhere like Cleveland or somewhere, you know. Every place we went to was almost like a different country, you know. Texas is wildly different to Miami, to, you know, we even ended up in New Orleans and places like that, you know. So we probably saw more of the country than most Americans see of their own country, you know, by touring. And Northern California, what a surprise that was. I didn't even know about Northern California, Portland and Seattle, and then we went to Vancouver. You know, didn't know about those places, you know, knew nothing of them, and they were the warmest, friendliest, loveliest places, and great gigs, you know. And we'd always get taken back to somebody's house afterwards. The hospitality was amazing. America was so friendly to us, you know, so welcoming, so embracing.
For me, because I've lived in California my whole life, and it's like such a big state that, like, you know, my family would go up to Northern California, like some of these smaller towns, to see other family. You kind of forget, like, yeah, but if this was on the East Coast, I would have been like hopping through like five different states to get there, you know, because of just how big California is.
People would drive huge distances to come to a gig, wouldn't they? You know, like, you know, think nothing of 500 miles to go to a gig. And then, you know, I can think of, like, we did one in Virginia Beach, and then these guys we'd met there was like, oh, we'll drive you to Boston, you know. And I got in this car with these people I didn't know. We went and visited Washington, D.C. in the morning. We went to the Exorcist Steps in Georgetown because I wanted to go, and it was like, we'll take you there. And then I had to be at the gig in Boston by 8 o'clock or something, and they got me there, you know, and I didn't know them from Adam, you know what I mean? They were just sort of like, oh yeah, let's do that, you know.
It's kind of the nature, though. It's like
nomads. So, you know.
Yeah, that's the thing about this music. It's difficult because, you know, there are always people out there that are, you know, cynical and exploitive. And so on the one hand, you have to guard against those people, but you still want the culture to have, like, you still want people to be open and, like, because that's a part of artistic collaboration, is just kind of like meeting people through different circumstances. I mean, it's so funny because, like, I was in a group on Facebook and I just happened to meet this guy. And then, like, we've been friends for like maybe 4 years now. And he came out here to California for the first time, got to meet him. It's just surreal how, like, I think people look at, you know, all the horrible stuff that happens on social media. But, you know, there is, like, still very much an ability to facilitate connections. I mean, just even getting you and my co-host Barcode on here, you know, I just always appreciate that about music and arts. Is when you look at it from a distance, you just see this stuff in kind of like islands, but the closer you get, the more you understand just how much collaboration goes into everything. And that's big for my art too, because, like, and maybe you feel this way too, I don't know, but when I work on a piece, I don't want to just have it sit there or just release it. Like, I want other people's feedback, because that whole process is what makes my art feel complete.
Yeah, I remember when we got a website really early on, 94, I think we had a website. And that was there weren't many bands with websites back then, but they formed like a community on the forum on our website. And when we went to Brazil for the first time, there was a guy who we'd been speaking to on the forum who met us at the hotel, took us out, was our host, and we didn't really know him, but we, you know. Anyway, but then he kept coming to Manchester. He came to Manchester a couple of times. I went out with him there, kind of thing. And then he got talking to a girl from Las Vegas on the forum. And I was at their wedding in Manchester about 10 years later. You know, then met through our website. One was from Vegas, one was from Rio. And they now live in Manchester because not because of the band, but because of indirectly because of the band, probably. It's like these, and this guy from Brazil, he couldn't believe that all his favorite bands came from this place, like Manchester. It didn't mean he didn't know where it was, what it meant, kind of thing. But he just knew that he loved the Smiths and he loved New Order and he loved 808 State. And it's just like, where is this place where all these bands come from? I'm going to have to go and have a look, And now he lives there.
Yeah.
I'd move to, I'd rather move to Rio myself.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
The grass is always greener.
But I'm wondering how do you sort of balance when you're doing a live show, sort of pre-recorded stuff and more intuitive, just in the moment, live stuff.
It's something that we've evolved over time because, early on it was kind of quite pre-recorded. And people forget that back then we'd be doing raves and you might do 3 in a night and you were only there to do your hit kind of thing. And it'd be like, get on and play it off that kind of thing. Maybe play a bit of something over, like, for instance, with Pacific, play the saxophone and whatever. And then, we were literally on and off. And it was like a conveyor belt. And then you'd be back in the car trying to hit this other rave. And then you'd be, like, for instance, we played a gig in Manchester with the Happy Mondays, got in a bus, went up to Glasgow, at like 2 in the morning, played at 6 in the morning in Glasgow. It was crazy, Eventually, when we got to do like bigger concerts, like, because we were having pop hits, we're doing 12,000 people, and that you had to put on a better show than that, We got more into visuals and things like that. And then when we went touring America, really sorted us out because, like, you really have to put on a show there and you really sweat and give show business, because, like, it's just a different culture. And we got quite more muso-y on that kind of circuit, and found our comfort zone kind of thing. Now it's with laptops and everything, it's a lot more doable because you can run all the tracks out separately and affect everything and have it rigged up to the keyboards and the drum machines, and it's a quite a complex system now of possibilities. And plus I've made space in these tunes, for instance, like Cubic and Pacific and all these things have like a lot of room for improvisation in terms of playing on. Some people really hate that. I get a lot of complaints about that kind of thing of like, why can't you just be pure electronic? And we have a drummer, we've had a drummer for years, but I buzz off the energy of that. I think the dynamics and the just playing off each other is really important to me. And though in recent times we've tried doing pure electronic gigs as well, and there's different situations will do different things, I've done like pure acid gigs like we used to do with we did a thing called Rebuild where me and Gerald got together and did things like Deck Mantle Festival, and this is about 5 years ago, and did pure acid jams again, and that's fun in its own way. It's a different thing though, to like presenting a whole 808 show is try and get enough flexibility in there and enough interest for you as a musician almost, to sort of like get some drama in there, get some unknowns, it's really important. I think we've worked that out over 30. It's taken 30 years, but it works out.
Also, one thing I know, Jake Black, the founder of Alabama 3, passed away, and I know that he was on your album from 2002, and
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what was your experience with that?
Well, again, Darren and Andrew from the band, they had a regular DJ thing going in a crazy place in Brixton, I think it was just like a pub, like the back room of a pub, but it was like proper rowdy kind of ravey night that the Alabama Three were involved in. So they got to know them, kind of thing, and then they cooked up the idea of a collaboration. And I remember arrived in Manchester with nothing prepared. We'd sent the idea across them, and they turned up with nothing really prepared. And I think it was Larry Love pulled out a John Coltrane CD and started to intone the sleeve notes over the track, and I was like, not really having that. Can't use that kind of thing, you know. And they were just clutching at straws on that. And then they borrowed about £300 out of my cash point and disappeared into the night.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they're supposed to come back the following day, and they just went missing for like 2 days, you know, so it kind of got abandoned, the first attempt kind of thing. And then they had a second attempt where they did it in their studio, which is on the album. So yeah, the actual get in a room and work things out didn't go smoothly, but they were just, you know, crazy rock and rollers, you know. So I was all ready to kind of work, you know what I mean, and they were in no mood to do that.
Yeah.
You know, they got a certain wildness to them that is captured on the record, I think. And we did do a couple of they both came and sang a couple of times on gigs around about that point. So there's a couple of live, probably got it on video somewhere, a couple of live editions of that tune that they were involved in. Yeah, which were pretty wild as well. We 808 didn't really fit in a lot of the time, you know what I mean? We kind of blossomed early, kind of thing.
Yes, definitely.
And then we were probably considered at times a little uncool in certain circumstances, you know what I mean? But then we'd come back and keep coming back, you know.
People on the outside look at 808 State and just think of like Pacific or maybe like another like In Your Face. But like, you know, even like 1996, 2002, you guys have like great stuff that I think is like just as good, if not even better, honestly, than your early work, because it's just like you see that whole evolution. And you know, I think that's true with a lot of, I mean, like we talked about Prince earlier, like everybody loves like Prince's really early stuff. And I mean, I think it's good, but I think his stuff in the 90s is, in my opinion, easily his best work. It's just true across the board. You always want to see, like, I'm always looking to see, like, what else did this artist produce? And, like, everybody knows them maybe from this time, but what were they doing later on, you know? Because I find that more interesting to track their progress.
Yeah, or side projects and things. Yeah, we also had this thing of being quite successful in the pop charts, and that kind of marked you in a way. If you were too publicly known, in a way, if you were to consider pop, you know, things like the MC Tunes records that we did, The Only Round That Bites, Tune Splits the Atom, these were pop hits, but with a rapper thing. That must have really confused who we were, you know, a public perception. But they were pretty weird records, you know, they were pretty odd.
What are these guys trying to be? The next KLF?
Yeah, in a way, you forget the KLF there was kind of permission to go crazy apeshit.
Yeah.
You know, they were making wild records, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to go and visit them early days, you know, 89 or whatever. There was a guy who was potentially going to be our manager, who was managing Alex from The Orb. And they were making records they had a house in Brixton. And studio was upstairs in a bedroom. I went to visit that house. They had that American police car in the living room. I don't know how they got it in there,
Wow.
but it was in the living room. And then we went over to, they were making some record with a load of ABBA samples in it. I don't think they got that past.
Nope.
That never came out, I don't think. But you know, they would cut up anything and put it in something. They really go bold with the sampling.
Yeah.
And they had all these Oberheim synths in there, and you know, it was a real cottage industry thing, you know.
Yeah.
And then another time they were in some studio mixing It's Grim Up North, which is an amazing record, you know, with all the sort of just a list of northern towns kind of thing, and the sound of rain. I remember mixing that record. And then we went round Alex's house, and they were working on this thing called Little Fluffy Clouds. And I've got a cassette of that they gave me that day, like a demo, you know, of Little Fluffy Clouds, which became this big kind of ambient anthem, you know. And that was in somebody's bedroom as well, you know. And again, like when I was working with Bjork, we weren't in some fancy studio when we wrote Army of Me, for instance. Like me and her wrote Army of Me and Modern Things in my mate's front room, and it was just like a little terraced house in Manchester, 2 up, 2 down terraced house with a bit of equipment in it, and we were just ensconced in there for the weekend and came up with those 2 big tunes, you know. And it's like, it wasn't posh, it was just really basic kind of jamming, and some big records come out of bedrooms back then, you know. It wasn't all fancy recording studios, you know.
Yeah, it's really invigorating. I guess when you mentioned sort of the reception of people thinking you're uncool once you become pop, more on the pop side of things. What was that reminded me, what was your experience of being on top of the pops like? Because I think that's how the general public are aware of 808.
Yeah, well, we knew it was important to do Top of the Pops. You know, a lot of rave bands really struggled with it because there was no easy way of presenting keyboards and, you know, knob twiddly, non-featured, well, particularly instrumental music like we had hits with, you know. There's no focus, and it was a real showbiz show, you know. So I know the producers struggled with this onslaught of rave, and they usually made you have a dancer or something like that. If you see Orbital on there, they've got a couple of dancers. And when you see the Orb actually playing on there, they're just sat there playing chess, which I thought was a brilliant move. But the best move would be to do a video like the KLF. That, mind you, they were on it a couple of times, didn't they? With machine guns or something. I don't know how they got that past the BBC. But yeah, it was an odd experience. But you knew that getting it across to the wider public would change things, you know. And it certainly we didn't compromise what the music we were making to make it pop. They were just weirdest pop records ever made, I think. You know, something like Cubic as a top 10 pop record is just, there's nothing like it, was there? You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah,
it's pretty groundbreaking, mad stuff, you know. So that felt like a victory to me to get it on Top of the Pops, you know, to get it in front of and it's kind of validation from, you know, all the people you've grown up with. You like your parents going like, when are you going to get a proper job and stuff, you know.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, so it was one, you know, it was like a fist pumpy moment for me, you know, of going like, see, you know.
Yeah. The final thing I want to say is, it seems like what you're doing is sort of, it's extraterrestrial, but it's also grassroots.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, I think it's the media underestimates the public's ability to deal with new ideas in music and things like that, or films. You know what I mean? It's like, if it gets in front of people, you know, and then like another example of that would be like Netflix these days. You can do some invigorating top grade stuff, put it on Netflix, and that's the only platform that people are accessing, and therefore everyday people accept what's on there, and it's like that was the same for Radio 1 and Top of the Pops in a way. It's kind of, if you put the ideas in front of people, they will take them, and it will change their landscape. I think that was interesting about that period of music, because there was so much rubbish about back then as well. The contrast between what was going on in electronic music and what was going on in pure pop, you put them next to each other, and it's this astonishing contrast of earnest, a cynical kind of music and an honest kind of music, really about joy and what music should be about, because music should be elevating, it should be, joyous and take you out of everyday life and elevate you, whereas most pop music is really the opposite, isn't it? And I feel that today, I mean, like with modern radio, and you get in a cab and they've got like, all the playlist put together. Just grind you down, just so absolutely grind you into your chair. Instead, like, it's like, why choose that,
Yeah, I find it really hard to believe sometimes that the sort of music that people choose to listen to is often just the music that you hear when you walk in the shop, and is really annoying and manufactured.
It's like what you serve up. There should be a responsibility to serve up, to filter that and what's the word? Curate it,
Yeah.
And we have some good people, what I mean? It's not to say it's all hopeless, because things like Radio 6 is, there's some good people on there.
Radio 6 is good.
Interesting stuff in the morning, even, and then you've got people like Giles Peterson, who's spent his whole life dedicated to getting great music across to people. He's of a certain taste, but I mean, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for somebody like John Peel, who was like, a maverick at the BBC and played. It made it a point to give access to all the regional music. Somebody like Aphex Twin would not exist if it wasn't for somebody like John Peel going like, I'm going to Cornwall to see what's going on. This is what's going on, So, and all that openness, that program for many years gave access to so many ideas from all over the world it elevated us from just something that we were doing in some back streets to this worldwide thing, and
definitely
we owe him a great debt,
Marianne Hobbs as well as a host who's really interesting.
She's inspired by his legacy, she's very aware of that legacy and trying to do something along those lines. So
they're doing some things.
No, I guess in America you have certain equivalents of people that have to live in those corporate situations but do good work,
True, yeah. I guess because I don't listen to a lot of radio. I listen predominantly to YouTube, so it's kind of on myself to sort of curate things and find things. But it just feels to me like from my vantage point, it's kind of all on me and the people I know to sort of curate stuff for me, find stuff that I really, you mentioned before, like going to all these different clubs in New York, and it's like, that's sometimes how I feel like going through YouTube is like, I'm just looking at all these different artists and musicians, some of which have a totally different, there's overlap, but totally different following. And I just want to keep from getting in too much of like a comfort zone mentality.
It's hard with the internet because like the internet does tend to feed back a bubble to you.
It does. Yes. It makes it hard. Yeah.
I'm constantly trying to break that thing. I have a radio show on a local thing that I've done for quite a few years now, and my whole thing is like, I was trying to break an algorithm. It's just sort of like put, contrasting, alter, things that shouldn't go together, just so you're just being awkward with music, but also just putting the entire history of music together is interesting to me. To put, to get the same buzz of something from like the 1940s, you can hear the same buzz in that as you can in something from the 1990s. It's like where the music culture was, and just a sense of that edge and thing. I think that's really interesting to play with those things, to mix it up, because there's so much hidden treasure, and so much of it is word of mouth. And if you are around musicians all the time, that kind of stuff gets passed around because there's a love of music there. But to broadcast it is important, I think, to just put it out there, because all the time somebody will discover a new pathway through something. That's what I want from listening on the internet. I just want to come across something where I get sent down an alleyway that I've not been sent down before, and discover some new stuff, because it's the buzz is in the new, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you can't always rely on modern music to be the buzz, and once upon a time you could rely on it, but I'm not sure. I'm just sort of, I want people to show me stuff. I want that feedback loop. It's like, what are you into, what you're playing, kind of thing. And I get a lot of it from, like, my son is really into music and DJing and stuff. So we have a bit of a family feedback loop, but it's kind of not enough. You kind of need to get out there. That's one of the things I miss about gigging. Because you go to the festivals in the summer and you pick stuff up, and you certain records are that summer, and I've missed that this year.
And too, you mentioned about how like tropes repeat in music. Thought that I had too occurred to me is like with Memphis. Memphis, Tennessee was, at the same time you had Nashville. Nashville had country, Memphis had blues, and then in the 90s there was the whole like sort of underground rap movement that was happening in Memphis. And it's interesting to see how so much music comes out of environments that are very bleak, and there's so much like uncertainty, and that often seems to be the birth of like a lot of music. It was that way, to my understanding, in Britain with gigs like, or bands like New Order and all that sort of came from these very industrial working class places. And they came out of that, though, and they became so big that people tend to forget like the context,
the strength of imagination in adversity. That's the like common factor, isn't it? It's sort of like you have to. Music is that thing that elevates you out of that. So much great art has come from the adversity that way. And I kind of, almost expect that the pandemic thing will throw up a lot of great art.
Yes.
But maybe it's not here yet, because you have to wait a year at pressing plants.
Yeah.
I hope so. But with all this art, funding in the arts being cut, it seems harder.
See, that thing of funding in the arts being cut is like, funding in the arts can really mess with things sometimes. Sometimes if you take, it's like a lot of really rubbish stuff comes up out of funded.
That's
stuff.
true. Yeah, because it often requires a criteria.
Yeah. It's not a hard, fast rule, but I would say that, if the more desperately you need to make that music, the more passion that goes into it. It's like, the financial thing is less of a hurdle than it was when we were doing it. Move music around so much easier. It has got more democratic. And I remember when we first started our website, and we were banging on about that, going like, you know, soon everyone will be able to make music on the computer kind of thing, you know, and that really came true. But then you just it's a matter of sorting it out and relying on curation in a way, you know, somebody you trust, you know, everyone has a mate who you trust their music taste, don't they, or whatever, you know. Those people are really important, you know, the kind of gatekeepers of have you heard this kind of stuff, you know. Yeah, those people are more important these days than ever, I think, you know, the people that get rid of, filter the rubbish out. You know?
So I think that we've had a really interesting interview with you, Graham. It's
quite a long one, isn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like 3 hours. I'm just looking like, wait a minute, is that real? Like,
thank you, Graham. It's been really lovely and inspiring being able to talk to you.
Yeah. So hopefully maybe see you in a gig soon then. Probably.
Yeah. I'm interested. Might go to the London one.
Yeah, it's in some west. Do you know where it is? It's kind of this place in. I'll have to send you the link to it, but I think it's near where you are. All right. Best of luck with everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thanks so much.
Good luck with the tour.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thank you.